morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So we're just gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining. I was actually not expecting this many people to come in 9 a.m. to talk about scenario planning. Happy y'all are here. I'm giving you all imaginary cookies for joining us. One day. At one point. Okay, so I'll just start with quick introductions. My name is Chiweta. I am a manager on the consulting team at Nonprofit Finance Fund. We'll refer to it as NFF. I am based in the Los Angeles office and have been at NFF for about 4 years and some change. I started off in the New York office right after grad school. East Coast is not for me, so I moved back to LA, where I'm from, and have been back in town for about 2 years now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mariesa Kubasek, and I am a manager with the consulting practice at Nonprofit Finance Fund as well. I am also based in Los Angeles. I like to say LA County, born and raised, which means things to LA people. And I've been with NFF for the last 4 years as well. I've worked a lot with grassroots organizations, nascent organizations, that really span a lot of different parts of the sector. So immigrants' rights, CLTs. And so I've just really enjoyed having the opportunity to work with the CLT network last year. And we're really excited to talk with you more about a topic that we know is top of mind for a lot of organizations right now.
Thank you. So again, we know it's 9 o'clock in the morning. Scenario planning might not be the most fun thing to do. So we're going to try to make this as engaging and interactive as possible. And so although we do have the deck and we do have slides, we'll be talking at you for a little bit, but we're hoping for you all to speak up as well and make it more like a conversation. There is dedicated time for questions and for interacting with one another. But if you do have questions as we go along outside of that dedicated time, feel free to raise your hand if you need anything clarified. Okay, so Nonprofit Finance Fund, we are considered a community development financial institution, which is a CDFI. We've been around for over 40 years and we have 5 offices across the US. So New York, that's our headquarters, LA, Philly, Boston, and Oakland. And so on the traditional side of a CDFI, we have financing. So that's where we operate more like a bank and doing lending to nonprofit organizations across the United States. Mariesa and I sit on the consulting side. So that's where we do things like this. We talk about different financial management topics like scenario planning, budgeting, projections, cash flow planning, thought partnership, things like that. And then we also try to work as a partner and do some knowledge sharing and a lot of advocacy for nonprofit organizations. And that can look like speaking to funders about more unrestricted revenue, funding the full cost of nonprofit organizations as well. Okay, so our goals for today talk about what is scenario planning. We also want to highlight a process for navigating uncertainty, and then again, engaging in peer learning and discussion. And so before we really get started, we really want to just acknowledge the environment that we're in. Scenario planning is an important tool no matter what, right? Like outside of this administration with it, it was already something that we suggest to organizations. But now in the current time, there are so many things coming out of the White House, almost like whiplash, right? I bet like while we're in this session now, there's probably something new happening by the time we get out. And so what we've seen so far, right, different executive orders, there are some government cuts, nonprofits are being targeted and attacked just based on the mission, a lot of increasing costs. So something applicable could be like construction materials that are going up, tax laws changing, et cetera. And what we do know is nonprofit leaders are probably already thinking about certain scenarios, but we definitely want to tie this into what's happening now and why we're talking about it in this moment. Okay, so before we really get into the material, we'll do a quick icebreaker type poll on Mentimeter. So before I talk about the prompt, if you have a smartphone, get your camera out and point it to this QR code to get to the site. If that is a little difficult, you could go to the website directly, which is menti.com. And then you'll put that code at the top. If it's too small, let me know and I'll read it out loud. So as you all get there, we're gonna be asking, this is one scenario, right? Let's say you get this unrestricted grant from this amazing funder, and then you're figuring out what you wanna do. So one, you can purchase a lot to develop with the community. You could put that money into facilities reserve. You could put that towards a salary and hire a full-time staff member or something else. Mariesa, you could switch it. Just give it like 10 seconds. Okay, looks like everybody's pretty much done. So we have a tie between put it in a facilities reserve, something and something else, hire a full-time staff member at the bottom, and then put it in an adjacent lot. So we do this just to see where folks are. Obviously, there's no right answer. It all depends on your organization. But we want to highlight that scenario planning, although we'll talk about challenges today, scenario planning is not just for challenges. It could be for opportunities. You might get more money and you have to figure out what are we going to do with it. So scenario planning can be for bracing for something bad or doing something to expand. Perfect, thank you. Okay, Um, and so at NFF, we talk about a lot of different financial planning tools. Scenario planning is just one of them. So a lot of organizations have to do compliance, right? 990s and audits, funder reporting. Then moving to the middle is management. And an example of that is a budget. And that's something you could do in the moment, right? A budget is a plan or a roadmap for the upcoming year. But sometimes when you're going through the year, you realize there are different events happening that affect what you originally planned. So you need to reforecast, and you could do that right today. You could do that tomorrow. Another big thing we see is cash flow planning. And so this is when organizations can figure out if they have a cash problem, right? They just don't have the money, or they have a cash flow problem where they know the money's coming in, but it's not coming in when you want it. So we see that a lot with folks who deal with a lot of government funding and dealing with the reimbursement model where it's supposed to come in today, but it's going to take 30 days, 45 days, 90 days, a year until they get that money back. And again, yeah, so scenario planning, we're gonna stick into the strategy category and today go over some best practices and some tips on how to go about it. And so, yeah, so it quantifies the impact of change. You have to just figure out what's going to trigger you to prompt action. Like I said, it can be positive or negative. You can get an infusion of capital. You can develop more partnerships, right? Or there's a lot of staff turnover or a change like a drop in funding. Any of these are the things that you discuss and work with your staff on when you need to start planning for the future. So what is it? At the end of the day, scenario planning is just asking what if, right? And I said it earlier, nonprofit leaders are probably already doing this to some degree, right? If something happens, then we do this. If this doesn't happen, this is what we need to do. And so they're already in that process of visualizing and analyzing the possible conditions that can happen, the consequences or the effects of these different events. And naturally, you think about how do we respond to them or benefit from it. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Thank you. And so scenario planning is appropriate for anyone in the organization, right? It's not just your finance person, right? It's not just the ED. An example of that is you're thinking about cutting a program, right? It's important to have program staff in the room to really talk about what this looks like. So it shouldn't be done just with the folks at the top. And so this is my favorite slide because I'm an overthinker just generally. And in my personal life, professional life, I have to remind myself everything's not in my control. there are only some things that I know that I have direct control over. So if we look at the bigger circle, the light blue circle, circle of concern, that's what everything that's happening. So all the news, all the things we're getting out of the White House, for example, goes here. And it can be overwhelming because it's multiple things happening on top of what's happening in the nonprofit sector anyway, right? The nonprofit sector is not perfect and wasn't before now. And there's a lot happening. So we're really going to focus on the circle of control and the circle of influence of things that we can actually do something about it. We can really have control over our response to a certain event, right? We can have control over how we plan. And that's important to remember so that we're not stuck, right, and frozen so that we can continue helping the communities that we serve. So scenario planning is really a process, right? We start with defining the scenarios. So I'm going back to we have to cut a program. And then once we define a scenario, we have to think about the consequences. So if I'm the ED, the executive director, and I say we need to cut this program, what's the consequence? Do I need to fire some staff? Do we have to let go of our building, um, our rental space, anything like that? And then you think about the action or the response to that. What happens after? And so something we learn as a kid, all your actions have consequences. So if you think about what you do, you have multiple rounds of discussion to see what the end result will be. And so this really becomes circular, right? And a really iterative process to figure out what the right scenario is for the organization. And so before you start, again, we'll say this multiple times, don't do this alone. It's always important to bring in other folks within your organization, sometimes your board, to really have a full understanding of what the scenarios will look like. And then you think about what your goal is. Sometimes the goal with scenario planning is you need to make a choice, you need to make a decision. And then sometimes the goal is, well, we just need to figure out what we can do or should do if this situation happens, but there's no other action that needs to take place in the moment. Okay, before I continue, any questions or comments before we move on? Mhm. I believe the network will be. If not, I will get your information so I can email it to you. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Mhm. Oh, sure. That's an excellent question. I think it's also up to your discretion, right? When we say you bring in other folks, it's when you're in a position where you need more information, right? Um, there is when you're cutting the program, for example, and you bring in your program staff, you can decide if you want to tell them flat out why you're asking, or you just ask the proper questions of what does that program budget look like? What will happen if XYZ happens? And also, because when you have a lot of voices in the room, that also takes longer with the process because you're always going back and forth. But I think it's up to leadership's discretion of the right thing to do because you know your staff the best and you know the best way to move your company forward. So you just need to know when to get the voices, when to give out information about how you're moving forward. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you, Chiweta. I'm actually going to be talking a little bit more about that first step, define the scenarios. Um, and it made me think to answer your question as well, or just to add to what Chiweta was saying. It may not be that it's as abrupt as either we cut the program or we don't. And potentially what you're also talking about is what sort of adjustments can we make to the program? And so that's another way to think about, okay, it would be appropriate to bring in program staff to talk about those adjustments. But of course, then you can think about, when do we know that we need to shutter the program? That's when you would maybe activate plans to communicate with them too. So just to give a little more guidance around the process and kind of like zoom out a little bit too. So hopefully that's helpful. So step one is actually where we spend a lot of time with our clients, defining the scenario, because you really want to make sure that you understand what kind of questions you're asking, right? Let's get really clear on what those what ifs are, right? And these are the product of many conversations where we're talking about what sort of decisions are ahead of you, what sort of factors are you considering, what sort of assumptions might you already be making? Let's make those really clear. And like I said, that can take quite a lot of time, and that's good, right? Because you want to make sure you're actually surfacing the right questions. And when you're defining your scenarios, we find that there are a few, I guess, archetypes of scenarios that we've come across. And so the first is pretty straightforward. It's go, no go, right? It's a very single strategic decision. So the contract that funds one of our key outreach programs was canceled. What should we do? Do we cancel or keep the program, right? It's either this or that. Either we move or we don't. And it might seem straightforward, right? Well, there's a contract that supports it, so why would you sustain it? But the reality is, we know we have programs that we're allocating a lot of different types of funding towards, right? And we also have, some general operating support from time to time. So does it make sense to continue subsidizing that program? This is why this is still a question, right? It's maybe not immediately clear cut. The next example that we see is, or the archetype is, A versus B versus C. So you're actually comparing three different types of choices that are similar in nature, but different enough that you're trying to understand, what is the X factor here, right? What is actually the biggest difference between these three different choices? So the example we have here is someone who's deciding between hiring a part-time grants manager, or they're going to bring on an assistant, or they'll contract out, right? So these are all kind of variations on a theme. They know they need the additional support, but what's the right type of support for the organization? And so they've even started to do some thinking out loud about this more. Contracting out might be cheapest, but an in-house role is more flexible. And if it's not a grants role, if it's just an assistant, that frees up my time to focus more on grant writing, right? So they're already starting to think a little bit more in detail about the comparison of these three choices. The next example we have is best case, worst case. My favorite. I have a tendency to catastrophize and also overthink like Chiweta. But best case, worst case is nice because we're not just talking about the worst case scenario. We're actually looking at a range of scenarios, right? We're looking at, okay, what's the worst case? Let's get it all out on the paper. Let's process that. And then let's also think about, well, what's the best case? And then we want to think about what's something that's sort of in between, right? And so the example here is, we're worried funding is going to decrease next year, but we just don't know by how much, right? And so, okay, well, let's dispense with magical thinking. Let's just put it down on paper. Let's say, what could be the worst, right? But then what if everything works out? What a question. What if everything works out, and what's that middle case, right? Because the reality is, it might actually end up being something in between. And this exercise helps you realize, how can we prepare for each of these range of possibilities, right? And then another one that we look at is multivariable. So when multiple choices or issues are independent, but they affect each other, they might run up and bump against each other, right? So we're starting a new program, and I just don't know how it will go. There are lots of factors at play, and I want to be prepared for a range of outcomes. So again, we're looking at a range of possibilities, but it's with a lot of different independent variables at play, right? We are starting this new program, but it's also in this particular kind of environment. Maybe also a layer of this, it's we're doing outreach to a new community. So you're really trying to account for like, what's the environment that we're making these decisions in? Okay, before I ask you all to talk to each other, are there any questions about these different scenarios? Yes. Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. You actually anticipate what we're going to talk about when we get back from all of this, which is start with keeping it pretty high level, right? Start with thinking about it in terms of absolute best, absolute worst, somewhere in the middle. And then sometimes I'm getting ahead of myself, but back of the envelope, high level thinking will help you already make a decision, or it'll reveal we need to get into another layer of detail. So start super high level, definitely. Don't stress yourself out. Back of the envelope sometimes is very revealing, right? But that's a great question. I also want to add another fun layer of complication, which is sometimes scenarios are a combination of all of these things. Huzzah. So it's like it's already enough that we're navigating through this time, but we might actually be managing to some really complex multifactorial scenarios, right? That will come out in the conversation around what are we trying to solve for, right? Um, and then that sort of informs the next steps. You know, how do you parse through, to what level of detail, when do we feel that we're done, right? But just to say, they don't always fit cleanly and neatly into these archetypes or categories. They might layer with each other. So for instance, like the A versus B versus C, I was working with a client around, do we lease? Do we purchase a facility at this particular price point, or do we purchase another facility at another price point? But it was also dependent on a type of funding they were seeking out, right? So will we also get this type of funding? So that's a multi-part question, right? Multiple layers. Okay. So we promised there will be conversation because we've been doing a lot of talking already. We'd love for you to find a partner and discuss what are the main what ifs facing your organization right now? Like, what are the conversations coming up? What are you all talking about? What are the sort of like sub questions that bubble up too? We're going to give you about like 7-ish minutes and then we'll come back and share out. Sound good? Cool. You can do at the table or pairs. Probably the table is best because I think we're a small enough group. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. All right. So that's time. I heard a lot of good conversation happening. I'd love to hear what sort of came up as you started this conversation. What was easy? What was hard? I'd love to just hear from folks like what came up while you were talking about this. Money. Say more about money. The answer was money. Yeah. Yeah. So overall, seeing cuts, some of them very definitive, some of them it was like a back and forth or a reduction. Yeah. And that's happening now. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. So we're thinking about insurance, we're thinking about rent increases, also maybe what happens in the, because we know the market can't always sustain that continual increase. There might be a crash. So what happens then? How do we fill units? I will also say like that resonates a lot as someone in Los Angeles. I know after the wildfires and environmental disasters, that's top of mind for everybody is, you know, how might insurance continue to change in California? So it's a huge what if that you're grappling with. Anything else that came up for folks while you were doing this exercise? Was it easy? Was it hard? Yes. Right, right. That was a really great example of so many multiple interdependencies that you're thinking about. And you're not only considering external factors affecting the organization, but also internal decisions and the domino effect there too. And I will say, perhaps your situation is not easily solved by back of the envelope. Yeah, that's my, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's one to go a lot more into detail around and test assumptions around, okay, so if we do make X number of loans, what does that mean for our reserves? And then if we don't, what does that mean? Right. Right. That's another layer too. Absolutely. Yeah. See, CDFIs do scenario planning too. That's how we became so well versed in this. But thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Well, it's real. Top of mind for everyone is the shifting funding landscape, and not just at the federal level, but also in terms of like high net worth individuals, foundations, like where are the headwinds going? Where might they be going? And so that can feel hard to wrap your head around. But what we like to say is like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and just start writing down those assumptions now and testing them, right? So we've talked a lot about the what ifs, if we do this, if we do this, if we do this. What we're going to talk about now is the then this might happen, right? So the second part of the process is imagine the consequences, which I already heard some people starting to do in articulating the what ifs, right? So that goes back to Chiweta's earlier point that this is a highly iterative process, right? You're going to continually be cycling through some of these different steps, and you might get to this imagine the consequences stage and need to go, okay, we need to go back and re-clarify our what ifs, right? So like I keep saying, sometimes back of the envelope does help. It's enough for you to see it plain as day. Okay, we have the answer. So that's why we say always start high level, right? Talk through what will happen, estimate super high level financial impact. And maybe it's like it clicks and you're like, aha, we got it. We have the answer. Or it's like, no, not yet. And so you have to go back to our friend, the calculator, or I call Excel my fancy calculator. Go into the Excel spreadsheets and start testing some of these assumptions, right? And add detail as needed. So each layer of detail will get you to a new answer or new questions. And either you've arrived at the right level of detail or you need to keep digging, right? And so that's actually where we come in and support organizations, because we know pretty well that nonprofit leaders are wearing 5,000 different hats. Forget 5 hats. You're wearing 5,000 different hats. And so we come in as additional support as thought partners to think through what are the different scenarios you're encountering. Let's take some of that stress off of your hands, and we can prepare those scenario planning templates. And we can work with you in working sessions to think through all of these consequences in financial terms. So when you keep going down new layers of detail, at a certain point, that detailed financial analysis becomes necessary, and it helps to put dollar amounts or quantify the impact of these different choices, right? So an example would be, if we scale back on this particular program, of course we are saving in terms of expenses, but now we need to go back and look at funding implications, right? So for instance, I used to work at a nonprofit tutoring center, and if we scaled back the number of students served, that might have implications for how willing funders were to support a particular program, right? So there's always interdependencies. The other thing too is you'll look at 1 year, but sometimes trends don't reveal themselves until you look at multiple years. So oftentimes when we're working with organizations to think about the impact of these different choices, we're not just looking at a standalone year, we're looking anywhere from 3 to 5 years. Usually 3 is pretty revealing. 5 can really see the change over time, but anything past 5, you do start to feel like you're just kind of playing make believe. Like it is an exercise in imagination. This is really an exercise in imagination past 5 years. So that's where you can start to see trends. You can start to see inflection points, right? When you drag out or you widen your lens, right? You look at more years over time. So this is where we want to show, like, sometimes it's pretty straightforward and you can just do a quick little back of the envelope analysis. And so we're using that example again of you lost funding for a key program. Do you keep the program or do you end it? And so they just wrote choice A, keep it, choice B, end it. And under choice A, they said, okay, so resources, meaning staff time, mental energy, money, and focus, go to that program. And our organization will provide subsidy revenue, and the community will be served through this program, right? Choice B, if you end the program, you lose some grants, right? Because there were other grants tied to that particular program. Other resources will go to the rest of the organization. You may have to let go of some staff, and you would have to refer out to partners for that particular service, right? So they're thinking about what will we do to make sure the community is still served, but maybe not by us, right? And it may be that for this organization, they feel comfortable with providing enough subsidy revenue, and so they keep the program open through the cuts. Or it may be that they feel that that's actually quite unsustainable. Maybe they don't have sufficient general operating dollars. And so they think maybe it's better for us to double down on a partnership and to refer out and cut costs as needed, right? So this could just be very revelatory, and they have an immediate answer. But the other thing too is when you have lost funding and you have multiple options for responding, that's more of a conversation, right? Now we're talking about different shades of a choice, right? So you have option one, no change, have a large deficit. We keep running all programs as is. We don't change anything and we have a planned deficit. The question becomes, well, what do we do after that particular year, right? Option two is reduce down the program and minimize the deficit without closing it. And then option three is close the program, right? Because if we look at these two choices up top, maybe it's sufficient, but I actually feel like there's more to tease out, right? And so that's what they've done here. They've teased out the different options to explore more in conversation, right? Because I personally don't feel like this is enough. I want to know to what degree, right? Are we sending resources and energy to other programs? Is there a middle case option, right? So this is how you can expand it out. And then I'm also just going to click through here. So again, this is where you're doing that high level analysis. And we like to show this because it's a multifactorial decision that they're making. And it's revealing new questions for them to explore, right? So that's another part of the conversation around imagining the consequences, right? You pull out new questions. So in this case, the organization is planning to pursue a new revenue stream or they're choosing between pursuing a new revenue stream or not, because they know that they need to diversify revenue at some point in order to reduce reliance on a particular revenue stream. But they are doing it within this environment where they know they may still experience funding cuts. So they're saying, okay, best case is it's minimal fund. We know there are going to be cuts. Like we're just assuming that, right? So what if it's 10%, pretty minimal? What if it's 40%, right? And so in each of these quadrants, they're thinking through these different cases, right? Pursue the new revenue stream, 10% funding cuts is in that upper left quadrant, right? Okay, so resources go to the new effort. We have to hire up. We need to do an investment in this, and we need to make sure that there's time for the revenue to ramp up, right? Then we also have down in the lower right corner, the other side of that, right? Don't pursue the new revenue and major funding cuts, right? Resources go to bolster proven revenue streams and we shore up our gaps, right? And then in between, we have these other cases where they're surfacing new questions, right? If they don't pursue the new revenue stream, but they have 10% funding cuts, then they continue bolstering existing revenue streams, but maybe they miss out on building a new stable revenue stream, right? That's an open question they want to test. And then in this other one, resources go to the new effort, they're training up. The organization does not have enough resources to provide initial investment, right? Because they had pretty serious cuts, right? So now they don't really have enough to subsidize this new revenue stream as it starts to take hold. So is it possible that this threatens the new revenue stream, right? It doesn't actually have the types of resources it needs to succeed, the resources or the time. So they want to test that question. So now we're making this more complex. We're still keeping it kind of high level in terms of imagining the consequences, and we're surfacing new questions to explore. Is that helpful to see? Any questions before we go into our next conversation? I know this isn't technically math, but I feel like I just introduced math. So, okay, great. All right. So just to close this out, we always, when we're getting into that point where, okay, we've thought through the scenarios or the questions that we're asking, we've defined them, we've thought about the thens, right? We're talking about then this might happen, and we've surfaced questions. And now we're ready to start digging into that financial analysis. We always start with your current budget. That's your baseline, right? This is your current reality. So it can be your current budget or your reforecasted budget. And then we have a lot of questions, right, that we will dig into together, right? Thinking about your revenue dynamics, what might shift or change. Similarly, with expense dynamics, is there increased or decreased demand? So that means your expenses will go up to meet demand. Are there any expenses that are entirely contingent upon funding, right? We only spend this if we have the dollars to do it. And then are there any new partnerships or funding opportunities that would require staff time and energy, right? It's not just programs that requires your staff time, which is, we like to always make sure we translate staff time into dollars, right? Because it's of value, right? And it is reflected in your budget. We always want to make sure that you're accounting for what time is staff also spending in the work of, managing to these opportunities and these partnerships. The other thing we like to talk through before we even touch looking at expanded out scenario planning is, what are the interdependencies, right, within your budget? And we kind of already started thinking about that, right? When we talk about, are any expenses contingent on funding? Similarly, is any funding contingent on programming, right? And then another question too is, what does this mean, like we were saying, for staff time, right? What are the trade-offs within your budget in addition to the interdependencies, right? So just thinking about all of those contingencies and interdependencies is really helpful to get onto the page. So that's step 2. And again, you can start to see how it's cyclical or iterative, right? Because then you may need to go back and refine your questions. Then we need to talk about the consequences some more. Then we need to make sure we're really clear on the interdependencies, and then we can get into the numbers. We're going to move into workshopping it and talking about your scenarios. So outline those implications of the what ifs you were just talking about. And you can do this in conversation and also jot it down. Think through, under the scenario you were articulating or talking about, like, what might happen to program staff, what might happen to revenue, what might happen to expenses. Again, keeping it high level, but if new details or new questions emerge, that's great. Jot it down too. Same amount of time, and then we'll come back and share out. All right. Cool. And it's probably going to be like more like 5 minutes. So we don't get to get too into detail. So it's going to really push you to think high level. All right. So same questions. While you're having this conversation about the consequences, I'd love to hear what came up, what was easy, what was hard. Oh yeah. Would love to hear what came up and what sort of questions did you run into, and what was easy about this part of the exercise and what was hard. Oh, that's really interesting. So you're saying when you were faced with a moment like this, it was an immediate decision. And so you're like, oh, we just cut. Right. Yeah. And that's understandable, right? Because it's very immediate. But that to know that you can kind of zoom out and look at those range of possibilities is helpful. Yeah, absolutely. And I've been there, you're like, I got to make a decision fast. Right. And that's again where we say, like, even the back of the envelope can help. But yeah, I think especially in nonprofit, like, we have no time. But giving yourself a little bit more time to breathe and do that. Yeah. Anyone else? Anything else that came up while talking through these consequences? Right. Absolutely. They're not easy decisions to make. And we know that on the other side of these decisions are people. And also, you're managing to the expense realities of your organization. Yeah. And as nonprofits, we know that we, like you said so perfectly, we're doing this for the community. We're not always going to charge because we're filling a need, right? And so we know that our work will always require some form of subsidy. So that's where it kind of complicates the thinking around these scenarios, right? It's like, what are our absolute non-negotiables, right? What will we never stop doing? And how do we make decisions to support making sure we don't touch those, right? That's a really important part. I might have cribbed some of your talking point, but it's coming up. So it's important to mention, always talk about what your non-negotiables are. All right, I'm going to hand this over to Chiweta, who's going to talk about planning your response.
Thank you. So yeah, I know let me check the time. Okay, we're gonna try to run through this about planning your response. And like Mariesa said, the first thing is figure out your non-negotiables. What can't be touched? What is something that you know, no matter what situation you're in, nothing will affect that. So it's very important to articulate that. You develop a financial and programmatic plan for what happens and when. Again, you figure out your triggers. If we get to this level, right, of revenue, if it doesn't come by whatever date, then we need to launch plan B or plan C or whatever option you're on. And then you want to be clear about your assumptions and your questions. And then the last one is to be very explicit about risk and how much you can really navigate, how much you can really tolerate. I won't go through all of this, but it's important to figure out the levers, the things that you can control, and the resources that you can tap into when you're in the planning phase. So just to orient you to the chart, on the left is the budget, and the right is the balance sheet. And then you'll see the arrow. So the top is things that you can control more immediately. And then as you go down, it might take a little longer to get to. So if we just look at expenses quickly, there are some things that are within your control, right? And there's others that are not. So something like rent or mortgage is not something you can really fix, right, immediately. But other types of expenses like travel, maybe you don't want staff to travel anymore and everything will need to be virtual. Or the type of office supplies. Maybe you don't get the most expensive type and you get something a little cheaper, but will still get the job done. Maybe you're thinking about Wi-Fi plan. Maybe you get the very top, but maybe a lot of staff doesn't go in person. So maybe we'll get a plan that's right below it. Those are some things that you can tap into if you're thinking about cutting expenses. And then when we jump over to the balance sheet, think about the cash that you have, if it's available and not tied to something specific. Do you have reserves? And at what point do you need to tap into your reserves if your cash level is too low? And then you have to figure out if they are designated by the board. Okay, so this is a, sure. Oh, sure. Kind of like your surplus or deficit, if you end in the black versus if you end in the red. So if your revenue exceeds your expenses or not, and how much you have available. Does that answer? Okay. Okay, so this is a practice about discounting revenue. And so we have a chart here, right? And so something you can do is you can list all of your revenue sources, and then you can figure out the status of that relationship or partnership and the likelihood that you'll get whatever grant you are applying for. So if we start with the first one, which is a reliable foundation, you have strong alignment there. You already have built a relationship with them. You applied for the grant and you think you're pretty much going to get it, but you don't have a grant agreement signed, right? The money's not in your bank. So you're going to say 90% chance we're going to get it. And so the 90% of the 200K, you're going to put the $180,000 into the budget column. We'll go to the next line, right? A sometimes donor. There is strong alignment, but they're not consistent. They've given in the past, but it's on and off. They're talking about renewing, but you don't know if it's going to be for this year, next year, 3 years, who knows? So you're going to say 60%. So then you're going to put $6,000 in the budget. And then you're going to do that for each of your revenue sources and calculate that and then put that as your budgeted amount. So you'll see the grant amount is $245,000. After you do the discounting, it drops to $192,000 and some change. Now, an additional thing some folks like to do is this cutoff method. So everything I just said, right, with the probability and putting the discounted amount, you'll continue to do that. But some folks who want to be more conservative about their budget will put a cutoff. So for this example, right, the person or the organization leadership says anything that we're putting 25%, under 25% chance of getting, we are not putting that in our budget for our revenue goals. So this is one way to say, okay, we're going to be very careful, very cautious, and not include a 20% if something's just drafted, right? Or if we're just researching and that's a very low probability. And so this is where we really want folks to put numbers down to paper and go line by line. And so this is really where you lay out all your different scenarios and highlight the numbers that are attached to it. And so we like to remind folks your budget is a scenario. It's very possible that what you budgeted does come true, right? So when you're looking down though, right, you have two scenarios, kind of what Mariesa was talking about. You can either keep the program or you close the program. If we look at scenario A, you have cuts all throughout revenue. Your earned income drops, right? Contributed drops. The government grants is a slight drop in state funding. You have a 40% loss of all grants. So compared to the budget, which was at about 3 million, it'll go down to, I'm rounding up, 2.3 million. We drop to the expenses categories, right? You might have to cut some staff, but very minor, right? You don't have to do too much. You reduce your contract staff. Then you have slight cuts in programming, your occupancy stays the same, and then you lower your admin and general costs. Now, when we look at the bottom, you originally budgeted for a $5,000 surplus, but if you want to keep the program, it goes into a deficit of about $500 million. And so that is one option, right? Now we jump to scenario B. You have 40% cut in both government and foundations. So if you look at the total revenue line, where it started at 3 million, scenario A is about 2.2, and then scenario B is a little lower on the 2.2 scale. Then we look at expenses. You cut program staff and others, right? You significantly reduce your contracts, and then you cut everything. You cut program costs. You have to cut some of your program space. And then you have a larger reduction in your admin and general costs. Now, when you look at the bottom on the surplus or deficit, you're still ending with a deficit, even if you decide to close the program. But the deficit is significantly lower at about $50,000 compared to the $500,000. And so when you have these numbers, right, visible, this is when you can have your conversations to figure out how you will go about it. And so sometimes when you do put the numbers down, oh, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It kind of just depends on what you're looking for. Like with contract staff, you can save some money, like they don't get health insurance, for example. Like there are different things there. There are some clients who say, we need to cut program staff, but we still need the bodies. So then they go and only do the contractors. And then sometimes they say, we really do need full-time people. And then maybe they'll add more work, unfortunately, to the folks within the organization, but say we don't have the that's okay. We don't have the funding to have the additional contractors. So it kind of, you just have to weigh the options, especially what the money looks like and kind of what you need in terms of staff for the work you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Any other questions on this slide? Okay. And so sometimes when you go through this process, right, and it kind of goes to your question, you have to look at the key priority areas Because when you look at your different scenarios, it's possible that you're like, I still don't know what to do. Even in the previous example that we just showed, like, yes, there is, you're in a big deficit, but sometimes you have to think long term of what that looks like. And so when you're still kind of stuck or frozen and not knowing what scenario to choose, you think of all these key priority areas. So we've been talking about the financial impact on this session, but you can also think about the mission. How do these cuts affect what we're doing every day? The equity impact, how much control we have, kind of the staffing need, time, and then the risk. And so when we prioritize where to focus, it also means that there are some other things that won't get, I don't know, enough love, right? Because you're focusing on one other aspect of it. But that's why it's important to think of all these different considerations to see what the biggest impact really can be. And so we just have two questions that we get from a lot of our clients about how do we assess our risk and tolerance. And then you just need to know how much of a deficit you can really navigate and manage. And then you should plan for things to take longer and cost more than you really want them to, unfortunately. And then having an active board, when do you bring the board in? Let them know early on that you're doing the high level planning. And if helpful, definitely ask for their support. And then the more intense or severe the scenarios are, the more important it is to involve them early on. So I think we are probably at time. But if anyone has quick questions, we probably can answer or talk afterwards.
Yeah, it is a lot to take in, but everyone had really great questions. Again, I think the slides are with CACLTN and it has our contact information too. So absolutely reach out to us, connect with us. We'd love to answer your questions some more too. Yes. Yeah, we have a lot of really great resources on our website for navigating through change and uncertainty. So we can actually send the link out to folks too as a follow up. And I think that's included here in the deck too. We do. 18th. 18th. Yeah. So in November, we're going to be talking about collaborations and partnerships. It's another tool that a lot of organizations lean into in times of change. Yeah. Oh, thank you.